Today, we're going to be talking about coping with loss and dealing with the emotion. Will I ever stop crying? Will this ever get better? Right? All questions that we've asked ourselves after experiencing loss. We're going to specifically talk about different types of losses related to the farm. My name is Monica McConkey. I'm a licensed professional counselor who grew up on a farm in northwestern Minnesota. So I definitely understand the stresses that come with farming. My work now really revolves around providing counseling services to farmers and ranchers and their families. So we talk a lot about losses in their everyday operations. Let's start by talking about grief and loss. Many times when we talk grief and loss, people automatically think about death, of losing someone, but it's so much more than that. Grief is the normal response of sorrow, heartache, and confusion that comes from losing someone or something important to you. And this quote, grief is an inevitable companion to love and attachment. So let's talk about types of loss. There's obviously the loss of life. And we know on the farm, when we look at the numbers of deaths by farm accidents, deaths by suicides, and just the general aging of our farm population, there is a loss of life. There's also loss of life on livestock operations all the time. And while we can, in our minds, tell ourselves it's part of farming, it's part of ranching, it doesn't mean that at some point that grief and that loss doesn't impact us. And I see this especially with kids on the farm that are growing up with animals and they are experiencing that grief and loss when an animal does die. There's loss of property. We experience natural disasters on a regular basis in rural America. So there's a loss of livestock, a loss of buildings, a loss of assets, damage to those things that is not abnormal. There can be a loss of normalcy. What does this look like? Well, sometimes there can be things that happen like a farm accident where there's the loss of the use of a limb, or there's the inability to continue with our normal duties or continue functioning in a way that we were accustomed to. So life is no longer normal. After a death of someone close to us, life is not normal. And we have to reevaluate roles on the farm. There's many things that happen that change normalcy. And that leads into the next point. Often with normalcy comes security and stability. So when there are losses, it interrupts that. And we sometimes don't feel like life is secure anymore, that anything could disappear. And how do we cope with that? And that can lead to depression and elevated levels of anxiety. There also can be loss of employment or a sense of purpose or dreams. And I see this many times with the outgoing generation on a family farm, or if a farm, for whatever reason, needs to be sold, and that's not what the plan was, there's definitely that loss of life's purpose, that this is what I wanted to do, this is all I know, and now it's gone. We see this with the sale of a dairy herd, for example, because it's just not sustainable to keep running the dairy, that there is a loss of a dream, that this is the first time there hasn't been cows on this farm site for 125 years, for example. That is all part of grief and loss. There are the loss of relationships. Sometimes friendships or family relationships are damaged after things like a divorce or after a farm transfer, and the healing does not come. And so there is that grief and loss over relationships that are no longer what they used to be. And finally on this list is the loss of a legacy. This really points to the farm being the legacy, right? And if for some reason you're unable to continue farming, or there's not that next generation in your family that's going to take over, that is a very difficult loss that is grieved, but many times grieved silently because it's not the normal type of grief and it's unseen, and people don't realize how much hurt farm families are holding. Okay, let's talk about stages of grief. This is an interesting conversation because when I work with people who are grieving a loss, the hope is that we're going to go through these difficult stages in order, and we're going to hit the last stage and we're going to go on with life. When in reality, these stages can cycle through and you may experience them over and over and over. What does that look like? Probably the best known grief stages concept is the one developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And in reality, she developed these stages for people who themselves were dying. And we have adapted it now and used it for stages people go through after they experience a death or loss. So, what I see with farm families who are anticipating a loss, as well as people who have experienced a loss, they go through these stages on some level. The first of which is denial, that this can't be happening, this didn't happen, I just can't believe it. And that's our brain's way of kind of protecting itself because we're not prepared to take on and absorb the shock of either what has happened or what is coming. So there's that sense of denial. The next stage is anger. How can this happen to me? Why did this happen to that person? Many people blame God or a higher power for allowing the death or the loss to happen. The third stage is bargaining. And what bargaining looks like is kind of trying to make a deal to either stop the loss from happening or to get it back. So sometimes it sounds like, please God, if I just work really hard, don't make my farm have to be sold. Or if I do this or I do that, that person won't have died. It's like, let me just make a deal and rewind the clock and get things back the way that I need them to be. It's that attempt to bring back our normalcy and security. The fourth stage is depression, where we really feel overwhelming sadness at whatever our loss is, whether a death or a different type of loss. And with that sadness may become a loss of motivation, a loss of energy, appetite changes. We may feel like sleeping all the time. We may turn to coping strategies that aren't helpful, all in an attempt to deal with that very deep, low emotion. Then the fifth stage is acceptance, where we come to a place where we understand this loss has happened, but life goes on. And my life is going to go on in light of this loss, and it's going to look different, but I'm able to establish goals and I'm able to start on this journey of living life while grieving at the same time because I've accepted that it's happened and I'm taking steps to move forward. Now, there is a seven stages of grief model as well. Basically the same, but they've added two. So the first is that disbelief and shock that comes before denial. And we know this feeling. If you've ever experienced a loss, or you've gotten that call, or you've had a tornado come through, or a fire, or whatever the case may be, that at first it's just that shock and disbelief, like, how can this even happen? Like, it's just, I can't even take it in. Denial is the same. And then this model also adds guilt and pain. And many times during a loss, we do experience guilt for something maybe we should have done or should have said or should have acted on and didn't. Then the rest of the stages are the same as in the 5-stage model. So knowing that you may experience these stages multiple times is important. It's normal grieving to be depressed one day and without energy, and the next day find yourself angry. I work with people who have lost someone close to them to death by suicide. And these stages of grief are very real for them for some time. There's a lot of that guilt. I should have seen something. I should have done something. Similar with farm accidents. Why didn't I check this? Why didn't I look? Why did I let them go themselves? Anger at yourself or others. So just know that as you cycle through these stages, it takes time to adjust and to work through. And even those days you reach and you feel like I'm at acceptance, I'm in a good place, if the next day doesn't go as well, acceptance will come again. So let's briefly talk through types of grief. First of all, there's what's termed traumatic grief, and that's grief that happens after an abrupt, unexpected loss. So like a death by suicide or accident, like a natural disaster that wipes everything out. There's really not time to prepare, and it very much has a traumatic feel because it involves life and death. And there's complex grief, and that is grief that actually seems to get worse as time goes on instead of what we normally see as people work toward acceptance and moving on with life. Complex grief happens for a variety of reasons, but the hallmark of that is that it worsens over time. Prolonged grief is grief that lasts for 12 months or longer and really impacts your ability to function. So maybe even after a year, you haven't been able to return to normal duties or things that you did prior to the loss. So again, it's grief that is long lasting. Every grief is different and everyone's reaction to grief is different. Typically, we see people at around 6 months returning to somewhat of their normal pre-loss level of functioning. Doesn't mean they're not grieving or hurting or having their bad days. It just means that time has passed and they've developed strategies for moving forward in that 6-month time period. So prolonged grief is grief that lasts for a year or longer. Complicated grief, much like complex, it doesn't get better. In fact, it gets worse as time goes on. And often we'll see complex or complicated grief happen when there's been a series of losses. So maybe there's been a death. Maybe that's led to the loss of a farm or the sale of the dairy. So there's compounded losses that make it harder to move forward. Anticipatory grief is something I see on the farm a lot, and that is that worry or that anticipation that we are not going to be able to keep doing this. We're going to have to sell the cows. We're going to have to sell the farm, but it hasn't happened. So it's kind of hanging out there, and the thought is like it's going to happen, but we don't have a date. We don't know when, but the way things are trending, we know it's going to happen. So sometimes anticipatory grief also happens with people who are experiencing like chronic health. And so maybe they're on hospice. So you know that the death is coming for your loved one, but you don't know when. So you already are grieving prior to the grief having happened. And then disenfranchised grief, I see this on farms where a loss has happened, but it's not recognized by others. So for example, the sale of cows or the need to rent out land versus farm it, or damage to buildings due to a natural disaster, fire, what have you, that you are feeling the grief, but those around you are not recognizing it as grief and loss. So you feel like you're not understood or taken seriously. And then there's frozen grief. And that again on the farm looks like I kind of think I'm going to have to sell out, but I'm not really sure because prices could go up a little bit this next year, or some government program may be available. But I don't know if it's really going to work. And you find yourself kind of living on that edge of loss, not knowing if the effort you put into making it work is going to work or not. So your grief is kind of in this frozen state. Okay. That is types of grief. And then I'm going to run through this list of best practices for farm families dealing with loss. And this comes from the University of Minnesota Extension publication called A Changing Way of Life, Ambiguous Loss in Farming. So again, keep in mind that this is not just loss in terms of death. This could be a loss of a legacy, a loss of your dream, a loss of goals, okay? A loss of functioning maybe after a farm accident or a physical health event. So number one, think outside the box. Brainstorm for new alternatives and options. The corresponding don't is don't be afraid of change. It's necessary for survival. Look at what will bring you forward. It doesn't, when we're under stress, often we see two options, yes or no, black or white, it's this way or that way. And our brains don't allow us to see all of the middle ground that we could brainstorm in and where the options lie. Do talk together as a family every day and at least weekly as a business. Have business meetings on your operation, even if it's just you. Weekly, run through an agenda and look at your business from a business owner standpoint. Don't forget to work on your relationships and communication daily. Often when we are grieving a loss, we tend to isolate. And it's important that we open up and engage those around us and keep talking. Gather ideas and information from outside sources. Don't shun yourself, or don't shun education for yourself or others in your family. So make a team, lean on your team, whatever your team looks like, whether it's consultants or farm business managers or counselors, lean on your team and get information from them. Listen to each other, respect each other's ideas, even if you disagree. So do your best to not blame, shame, or judge yourself or others. We've all made mistakes in the past. We've all at times wish we could go back and change things, believing that the outcome would be different. Obviously, we can't do that. So we really need to accept where we are and not blame or shame or judge ourselves or others. Do take some time off. Intentionally take time off. Don't isolate yourself. Do consider the impacts of change. And don't forget that any change on the farm, good or bad, is going to impact relationships. A family, a farm is a system. So any change in that system changes the whole dynamic. So it's important to sit down and just think through. And then do share openly about how you're feeling. Don't be afraid of professional counseling if you feel you need help. This is my contact information. Don't hesitate to reach out if you would like to talk more about issues around grief or loss that you or someone you know and love is experiencing. And this is also contact information for Karen Stallman with the Center for Rural Health and Social Service Development at the SIU School of Medicine. I want to call your attention to the website given here on this slide, siumed.org/farm. There is a resources tab that has a lot of really good resources for you to tap into and check out during times of grief and loss. Thank you so much.